Lyra hadn't woken up this morning expecting to become a celestial anchor for a monster, but here she was. The Alpha King's heavy head pressed into the crook of her shoulder, his breathing, usually a jagged, terrifying storm, slowing into deep, rhythmic pulses against her skin. Each exhale sent a prickle of starlight through her veins that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the fact that this was a death sentence. The king of the pack, the man whose very name was a synonym for slaughter and crushing power, was asleep on her. She could feel the hard heat of his frame where his chest met hers, and she could see things no one in the realm was ever meant to witness, like the way his dark, lethal lashes finally brushed against his cheeks in a moment of peace. The entire strategy room had gone into a vacuum of silence. 12 high-ranking warlords sat frozen in their high-backed chairs, eyes bulging as they stared at her. Vane, the king's beta, stopped mid-command, his fingers still pointing at a map of a blood-soaked border. A scribe in the corner gripped his quill so hard it snapped, the sound like a gunshot in the terrifying stillness. Lyra did not dare let a single breath escape her lungs. This was not how her shift was supposed to go. She was a foundling, a lowly healer from the palace fringes who usually spent her days sorting dried herbs in the shadows. Thana had sent her up to the war room with a simple tray of invigorating tonics for the exhausted council. Simple. But then the discussion had turned to the psychological toll of the mind prison Selim was trapped in, and someone had noticed the odd, calming shimmer that seemed to follow Lyra whenever she moved. Before she could retreat back into her comfortable invisibility, Vane had barked an order for her to step forward and serve the king directly. Walking toward him had been the most terrifying 30 seconds of her life, her celestial aura flickering like a dying star in her chest. Selim was a man built of shadows and iron, his presence so vast it felt like the sky itself was pressing down on the room. She had lowered herself onto the bench beside him to offer the tonic, her hands trembling so violently the glass rattled. It had been the most unnerving 2 minutes of her existence. And then, the impossible happened. The most terrifying alpha in existence simply drifted off on her shoulder, like he had finally found the only safe place in the world. The silence in the war room was so absolute that Lyra could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart, a stark contrast to the slow, heavy thrum of the king's pulse against her arm. She remained pinned to the bench, her muscles locking into place as she realized the gravity of the situation. To the 12 warlords watching, this was a display of incomprehensible weakness. To Lyra, it was a heavy, physical burden that threatened to pull her under. Selim's scent, cedarwood, cold rain, and something sharp and metallic, filled her senses, making her dizzy. She looked at Vane, whose expression had shifted from shock to a calculating, desperate hope. The beta knew, as Lyra was beginning to realize, that the Alpha King's legendary iron will had finally snapped under the weight of his mind prison. For years, he had governed through fear and tactical brilliance, never allowing a moment of rest while the ghosts of his conquests clawed at his subconscious. But here, in the presence of a girl who smelled of lavender and starlight, the crushing king had finally surrendered. Lyra gripped the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles white, as she felt a strange, warm resonance blooming where their skin met. It was her celestial aura, reaching out instinctively to soothe the jagged edges of his fractured mind. She was no longer just a healer delivering tonics. She was the only thing standing between the king and the madness that had been hunting him since the Mountain War ended. He wasn't just asleep. He was finally safe, anchored to reality by a girl he hadn't even known existed an hour ago. The silence in the strategy room didn't just linger. It solidified into a suffocating weight that made Lyra's lungs ache. Every time she tried to shift, even by a fraction of an inch, the Alpha King's weight seemed to settle more possessively against her shoulder, his deep, steady breathing a rhythmic vibration that hummed through her collarbone. She looked at the frozen council of warlords, their faces masks of disbelief, and then to Vane, whose sharp eyes had never left her. With a sharp jerk of his head, the beta dismissed the room, the powerful men scrambling out with a hushed, frantic urgency that only added to Lyra's rising panic. "Whatever you are doing, Lyra, do not stop," Vane whispered, his voice low enough to avoid disturbing the sleeping giant. He walked toward them, his boots thudding softly on the stone floor until he stood directly over her. Up close, the beta looked as haggard as the king was supposed to be. There were deep, bruised shadows beneath his eyes and a tension in his jaw that suggested he was holding a crumbling kingdom together with sheer will. I'm not doing anything, my lord," Lyra stammered, her voice a mere breath. "I was just delivering the tonics. I don't understand why he is dying, Lyra," Vane interrupted, his words cutting through her protest like a blade. He leaned down, his gaze piercing. "King Selim hasn't experienced true sleep in years. His mind is a fortress under siege, a prison built of his own power and the ghosts of every war he has ever fought. The healers have tried every draft, every sedative, every charm in the archives. Nothing works. The Sky King is falling, and when he hits the ground, he will take this entire pack with him." Lyra looked down at the king's face, so close to her own. Without the terrifying fire of his gray eyes, he looked almost fragile, the harsh lines of his mouth softened by the first reprieve he'd had in an eternity. She felt the celestial warmth in her chest, the aura she had spent her life trying to dampen, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "You are the only anchor he has found," Vane continued, his tone shifting from an explanation to a command. "I don't know if it's your scent, your lineage, or some fluke of the stars, but your presence has done what 1,000 years of medicine could not. You are no longer a servant of the infirmary. From this moment on, you are his living anchor. You will stay with him at all times, in his meetings, in his walks, and in his private chambers." Fear, cold and sharp, spiked through Lyra's veins. "His chambers? My lord, I am a nobody foundling. I cannot his reputation. His reputation is built on blood, and yours is built on starlight," Vane said, his expression softening with a flicker of genuine pity. "He is the most dangerous alpha in existence, yes, but right now he is a man drowning in his own mind. You are the only one who can keep his head above water. You will stay, Lyra. That is not a request. It is the only way he survives." Lyra stood in the dim, herb-scented sanctuary of the infirmary, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the cool stone of the workbench. The weight of King Selim's head still seemed to linger on her shoulder, a phantom pressure that made her skin hum with a restless, golden energy. Across the room, Thana moved with a deliberate slowness, her silhouette cast in long shadows by the flickering candlelight as she ground dried valerian root. The older woman didn't look up, but the sharp, rhythmic sound of the mortar and pestle felt like a countdown. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, child," Thana said, her voice gravelly but not unkind. "Or perhaps you've finally realized that the shadow you've been hiding in has vanished." "Vane told me I have to stay with him," Lyra whispered, the words feeling heavy and dangerous in the quiet air. "He called me a living anchor. Thana, he's the most terrifying alpha in the history of the Great Pack." "Why me? Why does the monster sleep when I'm near?" Thana finally set down the pestle and turned, her sharp eyes studying Lyra with a gaze that seemed to peel back the girl's skin. She walked closer, her presence smelling of earth and ancient remedies, and reached out to brush a stray lock of hair from Lyra's forehead. "Because you were never a nobody foundling, Lyra," Thana revealed, her tone dropping to a low, reverent hum. "I found you on the palace steps wrapped in silk that shimmered like the aurora, but it wasn't the cloth that caught my breath. It was the light beneath your skin." Lyra stepped back, shaking her head as the cold flicker of fear returned. "I'm just a healer. I've worked twice as hard as the others just to prove I belong here." "You belong to the stars," Thana countered, her voice firming. "Your lineage is tied to the celestial wolves, the ancient ones who could command the tides and the winds. That calming effect you have isn't just a mood, Lyra. It is a celestial resonance. Selim is the Sky King, a man whose power is so vast it has become his own storm. He is drowning in the vacuum of his own authority, haunted by a mind prison of his own making. Your aura doesn't just soothe him, it balances him. You are the only frequency in this realm that can pierce the discord of his madness." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with the weight of a heritage Lyra had spent years trying to smother. She thought of the way the king's breathing had finally evened out against her neck, the way the jagged edges of his presence had smoothed in her light. If he finds out what I am... Lyra started, but Thana gripped her shoulders. He doesn't need to know the name of the medicine to know that it is the only thing keeping him alive, Thana said fiercely. But you must understand the cost. By anchoring him, you are letting his darkness touch your light. You aren't just his pillow, child. You are the bridge between the king and the abyss. The first night in the king's private chambers felt less like a royal appointment and more like a vigil in a dragon's lair. The room was vast, an expanse of cold stone and heavy velvet that smelled of old parchment and the metallic tang of Selim's suppressed power. Lyra sat on the edge of the massive bed, her back rigid, watching the flickering firelight dance across the Alpha King's sharp, exhausted features. He had not moved since they arrived, but the air around him hummed with a low-frequency static that made the hair on Lyra's arms stand up. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like falling timber, Selim reached out, his large, calloused hand closing around hers with a desperation that he would never admit to while awake. The moment their skin met, the starlight in Lyra's blood surged, and the walls of the chamber seemed to dissolve into a thick, suffocating mist. The floor beneath her feet shifted from polished wood to cracked, obsidian stone. She wasn't in the palace anymore. She was inside the mind prison Vane had warned her about. She stood in a throne room that had been gutted by a phantom war, the ceiling open to a sky that held no stars, only swirling, bruised clouds of ash. The great pillars were crumbling, held together by nothing but the king's iron will, and in the center sat a throne of jagged glass. But it was the shadows that made her breath hitch. Dozens of them, wolves made of smoke and liquid shadow, prowled the perimeter of the room, their eyes glowing with a hateful, sickly yellow light. They were the ghosts of his conquests, the manifestations of a guilt so heavy it had birthed monsters. Selim was there, kneeling at the foot of the throne, his broad shoulders bowed as the shadow wolves circled closer, their whispers a cacophony of accusations that echoed off the broken walls. He looked diminished, a titan being slowly picked apart by the memory of his own brutality. Lyra tried to call out to him, but the air in this place was like lead in her throat. She realized then that her celestial aura was the only light in this entire fractured realm, a small, flickering flame in a world of absolute dark. One of the shadow wolves lunged, its maw opening to reveal a void, but as it neared Selim, a spark of gold erupted from where Lyra's hand still gripped his in the waking world. The shadow hissed and recoiled, the light momentarily searing through the gloom. Selim's head lifted, his gray eyes wide and unseeing, searching for the source of the warmth that was suddenly shielding him. Lyra squeezed his hand tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs, realizing that the sky prison wasn't just a dream, it was a battleground, and she was the only warrior he had. Just as the shadows gathered for a second strike, the vision snapped, and she was back in the dim silence of the bedchamber, gasping for air while the Alpha King slept on, his grip on her hand like a vice. The dawn light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains in jagged, dusty streaks, signaling the end of the first night Lyra had survived in the Alpha King's inner sanctum. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The rhythmic, peaceful breathing that had anchored Lyra all night suddenly hitched and sharpened into a predatory snarl. Selim's eyes snapped open, gray and turbulent as a winter sea, and he recoiled from her touch, as if her celestial warmth had burned him. He was off the bed in a single, fluid motion, his broad shoulders tensing as he stood over her, his presence once again a crushing weight that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. "Who gave you permission to touch me?" he roared, his voice a low vibration that rattled the glass vials on the nearby table. The vulnerability Lyra had witnessed in the dreamscape was gone, replaced by a wall of jagged iron and cold fury. He paced the length of the chamber like a caged beast, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of a heavy chair. "You are a servant, a stray brought in to deliver tonics, not to crawl into my bed like a common thief of secrets." Lyra stood slowly, her legs shaking, but she did not look away. The memory of him kneeling in that crumbling throne room, surrounded by the shadows of his own making, was too fresh to allow her to be intimidated by his barking. She felt the starlight in her blood pulsing with a steady, quiet defiance. "Vane gave me the permission, and your own desperation kept me here," she said, her voice surprisingly level despite the thunderous look on his face. Selim crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, baring teeth that reminded her he was the most dangerous alpha in existence. "You think because I drifted off I am soft? You think you can see into the king's mind and live to tell the tale? I could have you exiled to the waste for less than this impudence." "Then do it," Lyra countered, refusing to flinch even as his shadow swallowed her whole. She saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes, the microscopic crack in his mask. "Exile me and go back to the silence. Go back to the shadows that were tearing you apart before I took your hand. You aren't angry at me, Selim. You're terrified that for the first time in years, someone saw the man behind the monster and didn't run." The silence that followed was heavy and charged, the air thick with the scent of ozone and lavender. Selim's jaw worked, his gaze searching hers for fear, for mockery, for anything he could use to justify his rage. But all he found was the steady, celestial light of a girl who had seen his deepest agony and chosen to stay. The tension in his shoulders didn't disappear, but the killing edge in his eyes softened, just a fraction, as he realized the living anchor was far stronger than she looked. Days bled into weeks, and the forced proximity that had begun as a survival tactic transformed into an ache that Lyra felt in her very marrow. Every evening, she returned to the Alpha King's chambers, and every evening, the invisible threads between them pulled tighter, vibrating with a frequency that made the celestial light beneath her skin pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. They no longer spoke of her exile or his fury. Instead, there was a heavy, expectant silence that filled the space between them, a charged atmosphere where every brush of a sleeve or accidental contact felt like a lightning strike. The fated mating bond, long dormant under the weight of Selim's sky prison and Lyra's fear, was finally beginning to ignite. For Selim, the change was visceral. His senses, already sharpened by his alpha nature, became hyper-attuned to the girl who had become his only source of peace. He could track her movement through the palace without looking, her scent of starlight and crushed lavender cutting through the stale air of the war room like a beacon. The crushing power that usually turned inward to haunt him was now reaching outward, seeking her warmth with a predatory hunger that terrified him. He found himself watching the way the candlelight caught the golden shimmer in her eyes, his protective instincts flaring at the slightest shadow that crossed her face. The mind prison was still there, but it was receding, pushed back by the sheer intensity of the bond that demanded he recognize her as his equal, his anchor, and his mate. Lyra felt the shift just as acutely, her own body betraying her with a constant, humming awareness of him. She no longer sat at the edge of the bed out of duty. She sat there because the distance between them felt like a physical wound. When they finally lay down, and Selim reached for her hand with that same silent desperation, the connection was no longer just a bridge into his subconscious. It was a conduit for a shared, mounting fire. The visions of the crumbling throne room were replaced by a heightened reality where she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own, his exhaustion, his growing obsession, and the startling depth of a tenderness he had buried centuries ago. One night, as the storm raged outside the palace walls, Selim pulled her closer, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. The touch was searing, the celestial echoes within her rising to meet his darkness in a sudden, blinding harmony. It was more than just a sedative effect now, it was a biological imperative. The most terrifying alpha was no longer just a king she was meant to save, and she was no longer just a healer. They were two halves of a fractured sky finally beginning to merge, and as Lyra drifted off with his scent enveloping her, she realized the bond was no longer a secret they could hide. It was a force of nature that was about to change everything. The air in the royal bedchamber felt brittle, charged with an electric tension that made the shadows along the walls seem to writhe and thicken. Selim stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged tear against the moonlight, his shoulders heaving with a breath that sounded like grinding stone. The fated bond was screaming in his blood, a golden tether pulling him toward Lyra, but as he turned to look at her, he didn't see his mate. He saw a fragile star about to be swallowed by a black hole. The mind prison was fighting back, leaking into the waking world in cold, oily wisps of smoke that curled around his ankles, and for the first time, Selim felt a fear that eclipsed his own madness, the fear that his darkness would extinguish her light. Of the stars. The heavy oak doors of the royal wing groaned as Lyra forced them open, her small frame swaying with the effort of simply remaining upright. Every step toward the king's chambers felt like wading through freezing mire, the air thick with the static of his unraveling mind. Her celestial light was a mere ember now, a fragile spark against the suffocating tide of his despair, but the bond, starved and screaming, pulled her forward with the force of a collapsing sun. She ignored the guards who had long since fled the radius of the king's erratic power, and she ignored the frost blooming on the stone walls where his aura had touched them. When she finally reached him, Selim was a hollow shell of a man, kneeling in the center of the room as if the weight of the sky were physically crushing his spine. "I told you to stay away," he gasped, his voice a jagged ruin, but his hands reached for her before his eyes could even find her face. Lyra didn't speak. She dropped to her knees and seized his hands, the contact sending a jolt of raw, agonizing energy through her withered veins. She didn't just touch him. She dove, throwing the last of her celestial essence into the void of his mind. The mind prison didn't just welcome her. It tried to devour her. She stood once more in the crumbling throne room, but the shadow wolves were no longer prowling the edges. They were a roiling, black sea of fur and teeth, and at the center of the storm was the monster Selim believed himself to be. This version of the king was a titan of shadow and iron, his eyes twin voids of survivor's guilt and ancient bloodlust. He swung a great, phantom sword at the shadows, but every strike only made the wolves multiply, feeding off the hatred he felt for his own reflection. Lyra walked into the path of the blade, her aura flaring into a sudden, blinding brilliance that forced the monster to halt. "You are not the blood you've spilled, Selim," she cried, her voice echoing through the fractured sky. She stepped into his reach, pressing her palms against the cold, armored chest of the Shadow Titan. The most terrifying alpha in the realm isn't a butcher. He is a man who loves his pack so much it has driven him mad to protect them. "Look at me." Under her touch, the iron of the monster's armor began to melt into starlight, the shadows hissing as they were burned away by her unwavering light. She wasn't just his anchor. She was the truth, and for the first time, she forced the monster to see the man who deserved to be saved. The Shadow Titan roared, a sound that shook the foundations of the crumbling throne room, but Lyra did not pull back. She leaned into the darkness, her celestial light bleeding into the jagged cracks of his iron heart. The shadow wolves lunged, their teeth snapping inches from her skin, but as they hit the radiant shield of her aura, they dissolved into harmless gray mist. Selim's phantom form shuddered, the void in his eyes flickering with a desperate, human gray as he felt the crushing weight of his guilt being met by her unwavering grace. He had spent an eternity fighting these ghosts alone, believing that his survival demanded a perpetual war against himself, but in the warmth of Lyra's touch, the struggle finally felt unnecessary. "Let it go, Selim," she whispered, her voice a celestial bell that cut through the howling winds of his subconscious. "The war is over. You don't have to hold up the sky anymore. Let me carry the weight for a while." A great, ragged sob tore from the chest of the Shadow Titan, and the jagged glass throne behind him shattered into 1,000 harmless shards. The armored monster began to shrink, the terrifying alpha of the dream world softening into the man who was simply, profoundly exhausted. The shadows that had prowled the edges of his mind for years turned to starlight, the mind prison, transforming from a place of torment into a sanctuary of quiet, silver fog. Selim looked at Lyra, his face finally clear of the jagged lines of madness, And for the first time, he didn't see a victim or a servant. He saw his equal, his mate, and his peace. He slumped forward, his heavy head coming to rest on her shoulder within the dream world, a mirror of the moment their journey had truly begun. As he drifted off, in the deepest layer of his soul, the curse of his celestial madness finally broke, the discord of his power resolving into a harmonious hum. The vacuum of despair that had threatened to swallow the realm collapsed, replaced by the steady, golden glow of a fated bond that was finally, irrevocably sealed. In the waking world, the frost on the chamber walls melted into dew, and the king's breathing settled into a deep, dreamless slumber. He was no longer a monster fighting the dark. He was a man who had finally found the courage to surrender to the light. The pack flourished beneath a sky finally cleared of storms. Selim ruled with a steady, quiet strength, his gray eyes reflecting a deep peace bought by starlight and the safety of his mate's arms. Beside him, Lyra stood as queen, no longer a shadow hiding in the infirmary, but a radiant sun that warmed the entire realm. Together, the star and the sky governed a kingdom where no one feared the night.